Let me open first by thanking all of you for coming. I'm really glad that this effort at a virtual book club came together. It was a bit of an experiment. I hope you have all had a chance to really hear from some of SAIS's most interesting speakers on topics related to the book. Friends of mine and colleagues, Josh and Carla and Vali, all of whom really know their stuff, both from an academic perspective and also from a more policy-oriented perspective. And I also hope you've had a chance to interact with some of your fellow book club members. And I hope that something like this will prove to be a model either for SAIS or for Hopkins more broadly, something to consider for other faculty books, because we are always looking for opportunities to expand our audiences and to reach out to people, both current students, but also former students, alumni, the broader community, and so on. Now, today, what I want to do is open with a bit of overview and something of a synthesis. I imagine that most, if not all of you, have read most, if not all of the book by this point. But if you haven't, this will also be a chance to kind of pull it all together, and then we can take it from there. So, as I hope most of you have figured out, the book has basically four aims. And very briefly, I want to consider what China wants and what it's trying to do in continental Eurasia. I want to better understand what the states of continental Eurasia themselves, what they want, what their interests and what their aims and aspirations are with respect to China. I want to assess then how the third thing would be to assess how the, say, push of Chinese interests and the pull of regional interests add up and how that interactive effect really is likely to play out, mainly from the perspective of the United States, although I think folks elsewhere could also get something out of that analysis. And then in the end, and in particular in chapter 6, I want to consider the broad strategic options that are available to the United States in policy terms for how we might best respond to all of what is unfolding. Now, what I think the book's greatest, if I had to put my finger on what the book's greatest contribution is, at least in an analytical sense, is this point about how, precisely how Eurasian states themselves matter to what is unfolding in the region. And as I have said in a number of other talks, it's the agency, so to speak, the capacity for independent action, interests and aspirations of these states that really too often gets overlooked in a lot of the conversations about what's happening in the world. Too often we focus either on what the United States wants or what China wants and see the rest of the world as a kind of a vacuum or a playground for these great power aspirations or competition. And the reality is that what the local states want and what they're trying to do really matters a great deal. Now, at times I've described the region in the book, at one point I described the region as something like a coastline meeting the incoming waves of Chinese influence, particularly economic, but other influence as well. And I suggest that at times that incoming wave of Chinese influence will find kind of welcoming inlets where it can exert itself. And at other times it will find jagged cliffs where it's being pushed back almost violently. But even this image isn't entirely correct because it's not just that the states of the region set the scene for Chinese action, but that these states are also turning China to their own purposes, or at least attempting to turn China to their own purposes. At times, their purposes actually have very little to do with China, at least at the beginning. They have their own local, domestic, regional aspirations, and they want to see how they can use China to advance these. Now, as you probably know as well, the book tries to simplify this story in a number of ways. I don't try to tell a comprehensive encyclopedic version of what is happening throughout the region. Instead, I try to narrow the focus to several important actors, and principally Pakistan, Kazakhstan, and Iran, for reasons that I think should be relatively clear, but namely, they're important to China, and they're also important players in each of their subregions. So it's that significance that drew me to each of them. And then what I try to do, again, in a kind of a move to simplify what is otherwise a very complicated regional story, is ask two basic questions. What's happening locally within each one of these states in terms of domestic political economy and China's role in that? And what's happening between the states of each subregion? And you might call that a regional geopolitical competition, and how's China playing into that? So if we step through each of the regions very quickly, we can see and ask these two questions. If we look at South Asia, again, it's Pakistan where I'm focused, and we see that China's role, often kind of related to the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, or CPEC, is having what I describe as a mixed effect on Pakistan's domestic political economy. So while it is true that China is helping Pakistan to address some economic needs at home, in particular building out its energy infrastructure, which is important, it is simultaneously, I think, exacerbating some of the existing conflicts within Pakistani society. And it is contributing, I think, in some increasingly troubling ways to an illiberal tendency or slide within Pakistan's politics. That is, away from more open political debate and discussion, and toward a more closed political system, with the dominance of the army reasserting itself. So that's the domestic side. Simultaneously, at the regional level, where the principal storyline that I tell is the story of competition and long-standing competition between India and Pakistan, we see that China has equities or interests in both states. But that by moving into Pakistan in a more significant way with CPEC and other types of cooperation, this seems to be emboldening Pakistan potentially in some ways that lead it to take more risks in its dealings with India. And it also seems to be making India nervous and feel increasingly worried about China's role in the region. And I think we're already beginning to see some of the consequences in terms of both direct India-China competition and conflict, even militarized conflict, and increasingly high tensions between India and Pakistan. So that's worrisome. Shifting to Central Asia, again, it's a mixed story of political economy when we focus on Kazakhstan, the largest state in Central Asia. Clearly, China has bailed out Kazakhstan's elites economically in some important cases, including in the global financial crisis or after that crisis. There are also some opportunities that China is getting involved in terms of new infrastructure and investment, places that I had a chance to visit, like the Khorgos dry port and free trade zone along the Kazakhstan-China border. But some of these opportunities may themselves benefit, again, a narrow elite among the Kazakhstani society or within that society. And there is, I think, increasingly a thorny and negative, in many ways, public response to China's increasing involvement, which is related to an underlying latent, what you would have to call xenophobia, and also increasing concerns among ethnic Kazakhs especially, but the population more broadly, about China's treatment of Uyghurs inside of Xinjiang in China, and ethnic Kazakhs in China as well. And so this is already making for a kind of a challenging politics in Kazakhstan, where the elite know that their bread is being buttered by Chinese projects, and the mass public is increasingly worried about the consequences, the broader social, political, and economic consequences of increasing Chinese involvement in their country. And that challenging politics, I think, has the potential to get worse in the context of a serious leadership transition that may be looming in the future. Regionally, I think, again, there are mixed interests that China is pursuing in Central Asia, it's simultaneously eager to court countries like Kazakhstan and to stay on the good side with Moscow, with Russia. And so far, what it is doing is playing a soft game, trying not to upset Russia as it gets more deeply involved in the region, and claiming to play the role of the economic partner, but not to take Russia's pride of place as the principal political partner or even security partner. However, over time, I'm concerned, or I think it's worth considering, that China will likely displace Russia in these areas as well, or at least there's very real potential for this, as it increases its arms sales in the region and as it builds out its own capacity to be involved as a military player and a security partner throughout the region. And then the question will be, how will Russia respond to this, as its traditional place of dominance in the region will be threatened increasingly by China? Will Moscow sit idly by or be distracted by its other competition and frustrations, anxieties with the West, and especially the United States, while China presses its advantage throughout Central Asia? Or will it attempt to reassert itself in Central Asia? This remains to be seen, but it's clearly a potential point of friction between China and Russia. And then finally, in the Middle East, again, a domestic political economy story in which the elites and particularly the principal players who are in charge of Iran see the value of a closer connection with China, see that China is the principal demand source for energy from Iran, principal buyer of their oil, and principal supplier of manufactured goods, and that this has bailed them out in the face of international sanctions. But that the public is increasingly worried about what this means for the regime's repression of opposition forces, including through the use of high-tech tools of surveillance, censorship, and propaganda. And geopolitically, China in the Middle East finds itself courted, not just by Iran, who seeks, as I say, to have a close relationship with China, but also by the Gulf states led by Saudi Arabia, who also see China as an important buyer of energy and also a potential and increasingly important seller of technologies, investor in their own development schemes, and in some cases, even seller of sensitive military equipment, including missile technologies that they can't get from elsewhere. And so the question here is, with both Iran and Saudi Arabia, in a sense, courting China, Beijing has the luxury not to have to choose between these two suitors, but it will benefit, I think, increasingly from their vulnerabilities in the form of finding an easy source of cheap and reliable energy, but also increasing opportunities for influence in the Middle East, which has, as all of you know, traditionally been an area of greater US presence and influence. So that is changing. Now, when you pull all these pieces together, you can say economically, throughout continental Eurasia, what you're seeing is states increasingly being pulled into China's orbit. There are issues related to what you might call lock-in of Chinese standards, of Chinese technologies, which by extension means the locking out of or the reduction of a level playing field for other competitors in this region, including American and Western European competitors. And you're also seeing questions in the region itself about whether Chinese investment, trade, and economic influence are actually beneficial for the interests of local people in terms of economic growth, their economic growth, job opportunities, and environmental conditions, among other things. These are questions that we're seeing increasingly come to the fore. Politically, I think this is a part of a broader story in the region. What we're seeing is something that has elsewhere been described as an authoritarian surge. Perhaps not quite so much that, because this is already a region that has generally been ruled by strongmen. But what we can say is that as China gets more and more involved politically, there's less and less reason to be hopeful or to have aspirations about a more democratic or liberal turn or reform in this region. there's no reason to anticipate that Beijing would support that or engender that with its own actions. And to the contrary, as I've said, its involvement, particularly in the area of technology and telecommunications, has the potential to be more repressive and illiberal than anything else. Now, this doesn't necessarily translate into Chinese domination or in any sense control over these countries. I think we should be clear, because the leaders of these states are themselves jealous guardians of their own territorial sovereignty, and they want to be able to run their own states as they see fit and not to be told what to do by the Chinese. So less liberal, if not necessarily Chinese dominated. And then finally, on the military and security front, I think we, as I said before, are likely to see a greater Chinese role across military sales and also training and equipping of local military forces, perhaps even over time displacing Russia in this respect. But we are also seeing the potential that China's greater involvement in the region is actually fueling, or at least keeping alive, regional conflicts and competition, say between India and Pakistan or Saudi Arabia and Russia, in ways that are ultimately potentially dangerous. And at the same time, China is increasingly able to project its own military footprint further westward. So it is possible to see simultaneously the evolution of greater regional turmoil and greater Chinese military influence and access. So China's role in the region need not be pacifying. It may actually create more tension, but simultaneously allow for more access. And in some ways, and I will leave it here, this shapes up to be the worst of all possible worlds from a US perspective, because you can see an extension of Chinese economic, political, and military influence in ways that will make China a more capable competitor with the United States over time, without seeing the benefits of prosperity necessarily, or widespread prosperity, or peace and stability across this already pretty messy and difficult region. So I hope I've been able to kind of give you a broad sense in a relatively short period of time. And I hope you've enjoyed the book so far. I'm happy to take questions of any and all types related to anything I've just said, or anything that you've read in the book that was troubling or interesting or confusing, or anything that's happening in terms of an evolution. Good question. So you're absolutely right. And this is an issue as rail lines come up to China's border and then pass into areas of the former Soviet Union. You do have a gauge shift. What has happened in instances that I'm familiar with, so for instance, I mentioned this Khorgos dry port and area where cargo comes in from principally still from the Chinese side. It is taken off these, the shipping containers are taken off of the narrower Chinese gauge and then placed on via a gantry crane, placed onto the wider former Soviet or Russian gauge, and then quickly moved on. So it seems like what I at least have seen is an investment in the capacity to, to shift the gauge quickly and efficiently as it crosses the border, more than to build out the narrower Chinese gauge across the region. But I would anticipate there might be some of that as well. And there's a broader point I think that you're getting at, which is how is Russia responding to infrastructure developments, including in Central Asia, that are deprioritizing what has traditionally been an infrastructure, a regional infrastructure that has effectively always flowed into and out of Russia. And this is not just the trains, but also the pipelines. And the answer is that it basically gives Russia a great deal less leverage over regional energy markets than it would otherwise have, including in the gas sector. And also, this will likely be more and more the case in the rail and transportation sector as well. So if you're a Russian looking to, in a sense, control for both political and economic reasons, and possibly even security reasons, including moving troops quickly across territory, then this would be something somewhat worrisome to you. But my earlier point was that right now Russia is too consumed with its competition with the United States and the West to be given a great deal of thought to this. And as far as I can tell, for as long as Putin remains the man in power, and for as long as his tensions, certainly over Ukraine and otherwise with us, persist, this is likely to continue. So in other words, Russia's eye is not on the ball in Central Asia right now. It's on the ball in Europe and the West. And that allows China a pretty wide range and latitude for its action. So, but great question. I think that's a great and generally correct reading. In terms of the word that I tend to use is opportunistic. That where situations or openings present themselves, China has increasingly been capable of taking advantage of them, and that it looks more that way than China forcing itself on unwilling partners. However, two caveats to that. One is it kind of looked more that way in Southeast Asia as well, about 10 or 15 years ago. And China looked basically, and this was in the early 2000s, the time when I was working at the State Department, we would frequently hear from Southeast Asian states that, look, China's wonderful. They're proposing win-win opportunities for all of us. You, the United States, this is in the post 9/11 period, you're fixated on security issues and especially terrorism issues. Why don't you get your heads out of that and back into opportunities where everybody can get ahead, like the Chinese are? And it was a charm offensive coming out of Beijing that was quite effective. But in the past few years, what we've seen is, at least in some of Southeast Asian states, increasing concern about China looking more aggressive, about China looking to try to dominate them or to push them around. And that has led, including countries like Vietnam, hardly a longtime friend of the United States, has led them, though, to look elsewhere. How can we attempt increasingly to balance China and China's influence rather than bandwagon with China? And so one of the open questions in continental Eurasia is whether China will manage that act of being opportunistic and seeming to be a very eager but also kind of light touch partner, whether they can maintain that long enough to win over true partners in the region, or whether they will be seen as, I say, increasingly they have been in Southeast Asia, as somewhat more aggressive. And the story of the post-COVID moment has been kind of revealing and troubling on that front, because China's messaging out of Beijing has been awfully nationalistic and pushy, and has caught a number of outside players by surprise, and has led a number of them to be more worried about the way that China will use its power and influence, and whether they need to be more wary and find opportunities for balancing. So that's how things are evolving, and we'll just have to watch. But I think historically, and in many important ways, it's been better to see China as opportunistic than as a grand strategic empire in the making, looking to assert itself in dominant ways, but rather to seize opportunities as they avail. I'm going to have to say that I wish I could tell you more. And I've tried to follow it, but I really, Kyrgyzstan is not a country that I focused on either in this book and it hasn't been a centerpiece of my other research. So I feel like I need to be careful. What I would say is that it is a country in Central Asia that has experienced multiple bouts of kind of euphoria, political turmoil, change, but ultimately without change. That is still steeped in a kind of a depth of corruption and mismanagement that ultimately alienates each successive government from its people. And I'm worried that that pattern is reasonably likely to persist. But aside from that, I think it seems like it's still a moving target in terms of understanding the story, and we'll have to wait and see how it plays out. I'd like to be more optimistic than that. With respect to China, though, I think Kyrgyzstan is also a country where you've seen a degree, like in Kazakhstan, but maybe even more so, a degree of skepticism about China's role and what China is actually up to, and the Sinophobia that is widespread and publicly held. So I don't anticipate that to change. And then the question will be whether any new government that actually stays in power would actually open more doors to China than what we've seen in the past. And there, I simply don't know the answer at this moment. But it's a good question. I wish I could give you a better take on that. And Kyrgyzstan is one of the countries in the region that, if I were to write, I've been talking to people about the possibility of onward research, where I would try to pick up on some of the countries that I wasn't able to focus on, and either do some of the work myself or bring in other scholars to focus on those and ask similar questions. This is one of the ones I'd want to focus on. So thanks. There is a good debate on this question. Whether China, and this is true in Central Asia, but in other parts of the world as well, does Beijing, to put it bluntly, prefer to work with illiberal authoritarian states, or does it just find itself working with them frequently? And beyond that, maybe even more interestingly, does it see part of its mission in reinforcing the authoritarian capabilities and tendencies of these partners? And I think one answer I would have is, I don't think that China is entirely agnostic, but I do think that it is more opportunistic than closed-minded about who it will work with in other states. That is, look, it's willing to work with Greece, or other European democracies. It would be willing to. It in fact, I think in some ways has been in the past, would be willing to work with India. It's willing to seek investment opportunities where it can find them, but it sure doesn't shy away from the opportunities both for straight up influence via bribery and other kind of underhanded means that present themselves in authoritarian systems, often even more so than in democratic ones. And it also seems to like, that is, Beijing seems to like, or at least believe, that it is easier to work with what it thinks as more stable, long-standing regimes. And it is nervous, and in some ways for good reason, it's nervous about the prospect for political change that is brought about by regular elections, because it's been stung by democratic elections, where it thought it had good ties with the leaders of a country, say the PMLN government in Pakistan, and then that government gets swept out of power, in some ways unexpectedly. A year earlier, nobody was really predicting that. And now they have to build up new ties with the new government in power. And it doesn't, Beijing doesn't like that. So they also don't tend to believe, and this would be the last point here, they don't tend to believe, as many of us in the United States do, about the inherent dangers of illiberal closed regimes. If I look at these regimes, I'd say they suffer from the potential fragility that, if one man dies, all bets are off. That looks to be fragile or worrisome to me. But from China's perspective, I think they see things quite differently. They see that as more manageable. more control, and if such a thing were to happen, they can find their way out of it. Whereas democracies are messy and more challenging to work with. I know I said that was my last point, but just in terms of China's willingness or eagerness to support the illiberal behavior of these states, there I would say I'm not sure that this is so much a considered or was a considered policy by Beijing, but they have definitely seized upon it, not just in terms of the sales of technology for controlling the internet, for instance, in Iran, but also inviting leaders and managers and kind of mid-level officials to China to learn how to make better use of these kinds of tools and technologies, in many cases to repress their own populations. So I think increasingly there, even if they may not have originally started there, they may be heading there. And even if they don't think that the Chinese Communist Party system per se is the best system for all other countries, they definitely have no preference for democracy. And as I say, see some value in authoritarian illiberalism. So hopefully I covered the game there. Thank you. Absolutely. I think my short answer would be yes. And to expand upon this, look, China has been accused, I'm trying to remember the specific case, it was in Africa, of building a parliament building that included enormous capacity for surveillance of what was going on, basically tapping every line within it. And this isn't terribly surprising. More broadly, when you build your principal fiber optic network cabling system, say through Pakistan and onward to Africa undersea, and then back to China, you are definitely creating opportunities for the Chinese to have greater access and to make sense of what you're doing. There are also a number of stories out there about how China is developing its facial recognition capabilities through use of big data collected from places like Central Asia. And you can imagine what that will mean for their capacity to make sense of things. There's concern about these so-called smart cities, which China is investing in, which will have cameras and other types of surveillance capacity throughout them, which is simultaneously being built in some exciting ways as a means to make these cities more efficient, more effective, to move people around, to make it much more pleasant to live there, and to crack down on security threats, including common criminality. But the gift of all of that data to China is worrisome, both in terms of Beijing's capacity potentially to find out what's going on in its neighborhood and to use that to its advantage, but also for those who are more broadly worried about the kind of big data competition between China and the United States. There are those who will say data is power, and the more access to more data from more sources, say across continental Eurasia, and you have enormous populations that will come, their data will come streaming into China, the more capacity then you have potentially to harvest that, not so much in the security ways that you're describing, but maybe in commercial ways that would enable Chinese companies active in big data to make better sense of it and to therefore be more competitive and provide better services that will outcompete European or American or other services. So these are some of the ways that China's greater involvement in technology in the region can really play to its advantage over time. Great, tough one. And just on the Vietnam story, the more that I talk to people who are looking at China's involvement, again, in Southeast Asia, but in other places as well, Latin America, Africa, the more that I see kind of certain similarities emerging. And, some of this should be obvious to us, right? Like, it's not surprising that Vietnam is, as I say, a jealous guardian of its territorial sovereignty, right? We learned that the hard way. Vietnam doesn't want to be told what to do. But that should play out in ways that actually have greater consequences now for their dealings with China, who they see as their principal threat to that sovereignty or regional autonomy of action, and have less to do with us, which they see as now a distant player and much less of a direct threat to that. That changes the calculation in important ways. And, that's part of what, just to expand on this a little bit, that's part of the opportunity that I see for the United States in this competition with China. In many ways, we can try to regain something that we have lost in important parts of the world, which is an attractive power of looking like an unthreatening and somewhat more distant player than we did, certainly than we did in the post 9/11 era, where we seemed to be everywhere all the time and in everyone's business. And that engendered a certain degree of pushback just naturally, because these states simply did not want us to be present there. And China is increasingly involved. And so China is the one that looks more threatening. That plays to our competitive and strategic advantage. Now, on your other question, China is absolutely an unusual and in terms of US competition now, a unique competitor in terms of its economic heft and significance as compared to what we dealt with in the Cold War, where the Soviet Union hamstrung itself economically by its own choice of economic system and was less of a real competitor in that way. But whether or not that's the case, the military tool for responding to that is a pretty blunt instrument, so to speak. Among other things, we have to also remember that even as China is a military or a strategic competitor with us, and increasingly an economic competitor, they also own an enormous amount of US debt. They also are a huge trading partner with us, an investor, and an engine of global economic growth, and an anchor in better times and in important ways to global economic stability. We're in the same system, and we cannot attack the Chinese part of that system without also inflicting enormous costs upon ourselves. We can't attack it militarily, and even when we attack it politically and even economically, say through our trade war with China, we all suffer. And sometimes that may be worth it, may be worth paying that price for specific and narrow purposes. But we do have to be careful about that. That's what makes this looming competition with China so much more complicated and challenging than anything we faced, I would say, during the Cold War, because it is not just a question of a straight up competition of two separate economic and social political blocks, but it's a question of competition while we are also more firmly integrated in important ways than we've ever been. So we have to keep that in mind in terms of the kinds of tools that we choose. Want to draw the direct connection between the Trans-Pacific Partnership and what's happening in Central Asia per se, because Trans-Pacific Partnership had more to do with the Asia Pacific and some of our principal trading partners there, like Japan. It also included some Western Hemisphere partners. So there was a kind of a broader bloc trade effort that I do believe was a mistake to have withdrawn from for multiple reasons, but the main one being because it was seen in the region as among our friends and our allies and our partners as the principal face of American economic leadership in Asia. That was our main tool. And by seeking to further it, but then having to back or dropping out of it, we looked like we just completely fumbled the ball in ways that created some deep anxiety about American leadership, and then have in the subsequent period, as we've seen China successfully be a part of its own regional trading schemes, have allowed China to sort of not entirely steal that mantle from us, but it makes us look silly, divided, weak, and unsure of ourselves as a leader in the region. And other states in the region have moved on without us to confirm the now, the CPTPP without us. And that's not a good look for us either. The challenge, of course, as all of you I'm sure know, is that the American political system wasn't an easy sell on TPP, and it's not going to be easy even under a Biden administration to reverse that. So we've got a problem in that one of our traditionally most powerful and effective tools, that is trade promotion, regional trade promotion, global trade promotion, is no longer one that we see a unified American consensus behind in either party. And that, again, is a real detriment to our capacity to show leadership in Asia as well and elsewhere. So that's my real concern there. Okay, well, Central Asia and Kazakhstan or Turkmenistan in particular are not excited about the long-term reality of climate change and shifting toward renewables and so on. This quite clearly isn't the direction that they would choose to go. And like countries like Saudi Arabia, this is the kind of thing that really they need to be coming up with long-term economic diversification schemes that would enable them to effectively trade their current hydrocarbon wealth and buy with that greater capacity in other fields, whether it's industry or services or something else entirely. And if you look at again, to shift to the Saudi case, you look at Vision 2030, there are a lot of problems with it, but at its core, that's precisely what the Saudi regime is attempting to do, is to rapidly create opportunities, job opportunities, and to build out technologies and carve out a space for the Saudi economy that is not so utterly dependent on its hydrocarbons. And to do that by, again, trading its current hydrocarbon wealth or some considerable portion of it for greater investment that will jumpstart this other more diversified economy. The trouble is all of these countries, in terms of governance and capacity to manage this really tricky, difficult diversification scheme, it's just not shown itself to be there yet. The Saudis are more likely, for instance, than Kazakhstan to manage it in the sense that they have greater wealth. They've managed to find themselves more partners overseas, but even they don't seem to be moving nearly as effectively as one might hope, I suppose. Principally for governance reasons, and the current Saudi government has all the problems that I'm sure all of you are aware of in terms, especially of attracting Western firms and technology at the moment. But coming back to Central Asia, one of the things that Kazakhstan is certainly looking at, and you'd have to look to some of the others as well, is this notion of seeing itself as a land corridor. And that's why these stories for trade and transit, not just for pipelines. So that's why these stories of building out of train lines and so on, and highways to create opportunities for the region to be this land corridor for Chinese trade all the way to Western Europe, is something that they're looking at eagerly, because that's something they think they know how to do, or at least they can find others who know how to do it to help them build it, and then to manage and then to profit from. Whereas the other things are really more human capital intensive, requiring training and education, and massive investments in their own people, that take more time and that are harder to pull off, and that so far they haven't been terribly successful at. But yeah, it's a huge problem. That's the kind of thing that's on their minds, long term, long term. It's a great question. I like that question a lot. And it's something I've thought a little bit about, but not at great depth. Part of what I like about it is that when the Chinese approach these other states, and I do mention this in the book, you're right, the book has a kind of an interest-based argument, sometimes realist, not always, but I can certainly see that. But when the Chinese approach these other states, whether it's in Central Asia or the Middle East, they talk about history. They talk sometimes about even being the oldest, thousands of years of civilizational experience, say when they approach Iran, and a shared kind of deep history that both sides should understand. And part of me is quite skeptical about this narrative, and I think some of that comes through in the book. I mean, some of the narrative is clearly just constructed out of thin air, or if not out of thin air, it's kind of reimagined in some pretty radical ways that suggest an earlier history that just doesn't really match up with the reality. But there is still a reason, why Chinese leaders try to evoke, and also regional leaders try to evoke these narratives, because they know they have some appeal. You also see the opposite, for instance, in Iran, sort of frustrations with outside influence being likened to periods of imperial involvement, say, of Russian imperial wars and domination, suggesting that Iran is being taken over, or in Pakistan or in India, talking about the East India Company and the past experience of kind of effectively a history of economic colonialism, that maybe China is exploiting them in similar ways. So history is resonant, certainly in the region, and it is certainly a tool which all sides seek to deploy to convince themselves at some level, but also maybe more importantly, their publics, that what they're doing in terms of partnership with China is not only good in an interest-based way, but is natural and is a kind of a bringing to fruition a deeper history, and kind of coming back home to the Silk Road, again, in a way that historically is, to my view, just completely wrongheaded. I mean, because this Silk Road, or whatever is happening now in terms of regional economic integration, is entirely different from the original Silk Road. But it is still, this mythology is still powerful. So I think you're right to mine these questions, to try to look for more, to try to better understand which types maybe of narratives are more effective, which ones have hold out the possibility for danger, because like the British East India Company narrative is one that's really evocative in, say, a country like Pakistan, and puts China in a bad spot. So it can be powerful both as a mobilizer to work more closely with China, and then potentially as a mobilizer to raise questions or skepticism about what it means to work with China. So yeah, fascinating topic. Thanks for the question. Right. So first of all, thanks for the question. Good to hear from you. And yes, Professor Lampton has a great new book, Rivers of Iron. So you can have a look at that. Railroads and Chinese Power in Southeast Asia. And you're absolutely right that it has a kind of a complementary sort of line to it in terms of stressing the agency of local players. So it's not China dreaming up new rail lines in Southeast Asia and imposing them on the region. It's more the region having existing plans and all kinds of aspirations, and China using and playing into that with its own opportunistic take. Okay, so yes, definitely read that. Also, if you're curious what else is on my desk, The Emperor's New Road, which you may want to take a look at as well. I'm shilling for other people's books. And here's one I haven't read yet, but somebody's coming to speak at SAIS as well. To Rule Eurasia's Waves by Jeffrey Gresh. So lots out there on similar topics. Let me just wrap up by saying, to answer your question, yes, the United States, Japan, others have come forward with their own infrastructure agendas, new institutions, in some cases actually new resources to compete with, in a sense, the Belt and Road Initiative from China. My first response to all of this is I understand the impulse, but I am generally worried that it is not the correct way for us to respond to China in a global competitive sense. In other words, we have developed over decades now, really generations of professionals, a sense as to what we think is likely to be successful in terms of infrastructure investment and how to do it. And we have also learned through hard experience how to waste billions, if not trillions of dollars doing infrastructure the wrong way in lots of countries around the world. We do not need to ape or mimic Chinese efforts and relearn these lessons. We should probably stick to what we know. And what we know is that good quality infrastructure is often less about the dollar amount and more about the governance and institutional structures that help to maintain whatever it is that's being built and make the most of it once it's been built. And if you don't have those things in place, then you can build all kinds of stuff and it will fall apart pretty quickly. And it will also earn you the kind of the ire rather than the admiration of local states where you built it. So we don't need to go down that path, and I hope we don't. Now, the Japanese are doing a lot, and you mentioned them, I think, for good reason, because they're doing a lot with a lot of money, but also at high quality, and that's at the core of their message. But that's not a new message out of Japan. And so I'd say stick with that, continue to do those things, continue to believe that we actually know what we're doing, to have that confidence that we and our partners actually do infrastructure well and more wisely than we think the Chinese do. Perhaps beef it up in certain critical areas where we do see needs. There is a crying need for more infrastructure. That's why, in many ways, this is popular. So there may be more that we could do. The institutions that we've begun to build in the States are probably adequate to do that, maybe a bit more. But the most important thing I would conclude with is do not allow the infrastructure story to distract us from the broader set of activities that China is undertaking and the challenges that it poses to these regions and to the United States in terms of longstanding U.S. interests and influence and activities and relationships are not just being threatened by Chinese infrastructure, but by the other types of things that I try to describe in the book. And these things go hand in hand. And so if we become too fixated, as I think the debate has often been, on the infrastructure story, we're missing the political story, we're missing the economic story, where in fact we have other tools that the Chinese don't have. We have both appealing opportunities for cooperation in science and technology or education or so on. And we have resources, including in the defense and security sector, that are also quite appealing to these partners, that are even better than what the Chinese have on offer. And so we have tools and powers and capabilities that we shouldn't overlook or be too unconfident about. which I think we have been in recent years. So that's where I hope we play to our strengths, and we emphasize our relations with our partners first and foremost. So I think we've come past the end of our time. I apologize. Thank you for your indulgence of an extra 6 or 7 minutes, and great to see all of you. Some familiar faces and otherwise.